Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. It was a pleasure to be part of the team that put together this Global Hunger Index. And what I want to do in the few minutes I have is talk a little bit about the study that I did for the Global Hunger Index, and then also add a little bit onto the end about some of the ongoing research stemming from the conversation that we had around the launch of that I followed up on. So my story is both very deeply grim, but also, at the end of the day, rather optimistic. It's grim in that over the last century and a half or so, about 90 million people have died in man-made famines. And I say man-made because I don't think any of them were woman-made. It is optimistic in that I think we can see an end to this, though the ending is a considerable challenge. Now, let me emphasize that two things about this presentation. I'm going to give a very long historical overview, looking at back almost 150 years. And secondly, I'm talking about major famines, great famines, which are defined as those that kill 100,000 or more people during a defined episode of accentuated deaths from hunger and associated diseases, and calamitous famines that kill 1 million or more people. I'm not talking about chronic hunger. So the first finding, the first major finding, is this one. If I can make this work. Yeah. This is a chart which goes from the 1870s to the current day. The numbers of people who died per decade in great and calamitous famines. This is the lower reasonable estimate. In the Global Hunger Index, I used a slightly different figure, which was the median estimate, which was a little bit higher. But let me present the lowest, the lower estimate given with a lot of confidence. 116.6 million people have died in these famines, about 90 million of them in very specifically man-made famines. Now, what this shows is that in the century from 1870 to 1969, there were about 1.2 million people on average dying per year in these famines, 12 million per decade. In the last 25 years, there's been a total of just over 1 million people dying, 1.2 million. So that is a tremendous improvement. However, there is still work to be done. Now, where were these deaths? East Asia, particularly China, responsible for about half the total. South Asia for another big chunk. Interestingly, and perhaps surprisingly, Europe, 25 million. Africa comes in on this long historical trajectory relatively low, which is perhaps intriguing. And then the Americas and the Middle East with much smaller numbers. Let's look at these over time. And what we see in this graph, the dotted line is the totals. What we see is the first period, 1870s to First World War, from famines pretty much all over the colonial world. Famines associated with imperialism and its impacts. A second period associated with this hump, orange hump here with a slightly lower red hump beneath it. These are the famines associated with the Second World War. Yeah, okay. Thank you. These are the famines associated with the Second World War, with totalitarianism in the 1930s and the Second World War in Europe and Asia. And then the third great peak is Asian communism, and particularly the Great Leap Forward famine in China, 1958 to 62, which spans 2 decades. That killed about 30 million, just under 30 million people is the lowest minimum estimate. And so the actual peak would be way up, but it's split between 2 decades, and therefore the peak here is blunted. So that is the sort of the history of the 3 great waves of famine in the last 150 years, and then the famines of the last 40 years or so much, much smaller by historic levels. The two greatest famines in Africa over the last half century being Biafra, which may have killed as many as 1 million people, Ethiopia in the mid-80s, which may have killed a comparable number as well. But by historic standards, nothing like as bad as the famines of the previous decades. What were the causes? We coded them by all these episodes of famine by cause. Armed conflict, 47.1 million people died in famines associated with armed conflict. Active political repression, that's totalitarianism. That's in Mao's Great Leap Forward famine and other mainly communist famines. Also some of the forced starvation inflicted by the Nazis. And then conflicts without major conflict or political repression, just under a quarter of the whole. And then if we see these over time, you'll see again the same pattern recurring that I referred to before. During the colonial period, a mixture of causes. During the 1930s and 40s, mainly war, and then the great communist famines in the 50s, 60s, and into 1970s, Cambodia being the last one. North Korea also figuring on this, but interestingly, the figures for the North Korean famine, as demographers look at them more closely, they actually are reduced. The initial estimates were as many as 3 million dead, but actually the real figure seems to be, fortunately, just a fraction of that. A clear, very clear correlation that we can see between armed conflict, totalitarian systems, and famine. Let me just elaborate one little bit more on this, which is something that wasn't contained in the piece that I wrote for the GHI, but refers back to my book of some 20 years ago called Famine Crimes, in which I argued that it was necessary to see the infliction of famine as a crime, not as a natural calamity. And you may find it difficult to read this. I coded, there was a legal scholar called David Marcus who produced a 4-point scale for famine crimes. First degree famine crimes is really famine crimes as genocide, where government or rebel forces deliberately starving people with the intent of eliminating them. Second degree is where there is clear culpable responsibility. It may not be the primary intention to destroy people, but it is the foreseeable outcome of military policies. Third degree is indifference, and fourth degree are just where the authorities are incapable or incapacitated. And here we are. Overall, what we see is that first degree is in the purple, and you just see these totalitarian famines, these Nazi hunger plan famines, these famines of Stalin at the height of his power in the 30s and 40s. But then what you see overwhelmingly is second degree famines as the foreseeable product of armed conflict or misguided government policies, overwhelmingly responsible for the majority of famine deaths in the late 19th and 20th century, and those fading away, fortunately. So the question really is it over? Now, my apologies, I should have also shown this of the median graph, the median estimate, because the median estimate has one little tweak to this, which is instead of fading away, there's a little upturn. And that reflects the fact that all measures that we have of armed conflict and also the measures that we have of malnutrition contained in the GHI, in the last 7 or 8 years, they've been going up. They've been going up significantly, by no means up to the levels that we saw in the middle of the last century. I mean, we're nowhere near the levels of famine that we saw in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. But nonetheless, an upturn. And where does this upturn occur in? The countries unfortunately, these are the countries where the data gaps for the GHI are most striking. Countries like Somalia, like Yemen, like Syria, like South Sudan, where it's most difficult to get information of the rigor required to be inputted into the GHI, but nonetheless, humanitarian agencies and others are generating data that is sufficiently reliable for us to get a good handle on what is going on. So Somalia, Yemen, Syria, South Sudan. What they have in common is that they are all conflicts. They're all vicious armed conflicts. They're conflicts in which, in several cases, the humanitarians have made extraordinary efforts to get assistance to those in need. And the humanitarian technologies and efforts of today are immensely enhanced on what they were even a generation ago. We are much, much better at getting assistance and getting life-saving assistance to the people who need it. Specific technologies like discouraging people's congregation in highly unsanitary famine camps where there's high levels of transmission of disease, much better child vaccination policies, much better therapeutic feeding. All these things have massively reduced mortality levels in emergencies, but not by any means to zero. We saw the most terrible famine thus far of this century was in Somalia. 2012, somewhere between 168 and 258,000 people died, and died needlessly. These were people who died, mainly children who died primarily because of the predatory and extractive policies of the insurgent extremist group Al-Shabaab. And also because of their obstruction on relief. But a secondary factor, and a factor that I want to highlight, is that in that famine, the international relief response was delayed because of restrictions on providing assistance that might in any way fall into the hands of a group designated as a terrorist group. So international agencies felt themselves constrained by the Patriot Act from operating in Somalia. And not just US agencies, but and indeed not just US NGOs, but USAID itself and the United Nations and many international NGOs felt constrained. They feel constrained in similar ways in Syria and in Yemen today. And I would say that this policy is not only ethically wrong. I think that it's profoundly wrong to restrict humanitarian assistance to those people who happen to live, have the misfortune to live in areas controlled by groups that are designated as terrorists. But also, I think it's politically wrong because what it does is it implies that we don't care, that we care more about weakening terrorists by making the people whom they control suffer than it does about the lives of those people themselves. So I would say that the challenges going forward in terms of bringing that line back down and bringing it down to zero, and these are challenges that can be achieved, are challenges of conflict prevention, of conflict resolution, of better peacekeeping, and also of finding a way in which we can get to grips with the challenge of terrorism in a way that protects both our own humanitarian and human values and also the people who have the misfortune of living in those places. Thank you.